Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I don't know about the timing of this. As I was heading into Beijing over the weekend before this previous one, the climate change bill in the United States Senate was collapsing as the sponsors pulled out. So I don't know if you've been following that debate in the U.S., but I'm here to try to explain as best I can what's going on the climate change debate in the United States and what I see as the prospects around the world. In some ways, from my standpoint, the situation is rather dire. Basically, the science of climate change was, I would say, stabilized in the late 1970s. The Rio Treaty in 1992 got things off to a good start from a policy standpoint, in which the developing nations announced that they would try to stabilize their carbon emissions at 1990 levels. The problem with that is that the developed nations did not do that, with some exceptions. One of the nations that did not stabilize its carbon emissions was the United States, but the United States was not alone. The idea was, at the time, that it was necessary to ask for commitments from the developing nations, that the developed nations would kick off the ball and get this rolling, much as has been done with other environmental issues around the world, including the agreement to stop emissions that would put a hole in the ozone layer back in the 1980s, a successful international agreement in which the developed nations went first. So when the nations did not meet their commitments, it did not set a good basis for Kyoto. But at the Kyoto Treaty, the United States was very involved in the negotiations, had a lot of impact on what was agreed to. But at that point, the developed nations agreed to cuts, not just stabilization. But as the developing nations were coming on strong, there started to be requests for responsibilities on their parts, even though the developed nations as a whole had not done that much. Eventually, all the nations of the world, developed nations, signed the Kyoto Agreement, and then only one nation did not ratify the agreement, the United States. So all along, the United States was not putting a price on carbon or anything else, but I might add that a lot of nations were not doing that, even ones that had signed the Kyoto Treaty. Signing the Kyoto Treaty did not seem to automatically mean that nations would reduce their carbon emissions or even stabilize them. The two nations, I do like to pat people on the back when they do a good job. Two nations have had serious success in reducing carbon emissions, the United Kingdom and Germany. Even some of the others that you might think of have done a good job to stabilize, which is progress of sorts, but they haven't really seen the kind of cuts that Kyoto was thinking of. Therefore, when we got, and I would say that, and get into a little bit of American politics here. Going back to Kyoto, where I think a lot of this problem with Copenhagen originates, the president has to get any treaty ratified by 2/3 of the Senate. And the reason that you have that extraordinary requirement is that a treaty becomes enforceable as domestic law. So it's a big deal. You just don't sign a treaty and then kind of walk away from it. And before President Clinton went to Kyoto, the Senate passed a resolution saying that President Clinton should not sign any agreement which would harm economic growth or would not involve significant commitments by the developing nations, or they said all nations. It passed 98-0. So there had been a signal sent to the administration to be careful at Kyoto. And when it got back, the administration never submitted the treaty to Congress because it knew it would fail. I thought and recommended at the time, I was in the government at the time, that it would have made more sense to send it up and have it fail and then be able to move on rather than just having it hanging there. So when Copenhagen came along, I was in an awkward position because there was an environmental TV network that we have in the United States that was doing an end-of-the-year wrap-up. And I was one of the guests to wrap up the year in energy for this program. But the host was going to be in Copenhagen, so she had to do the interview before Copenhagen existed, but I had to comment on whether it was successful or not. But it was actually quite easy because several weeks before Copenhagen, I said there is no way that an agreement can be reached because there's no pieces or foundation on which an agreement could be reached. Because the position that the United States has taken since Kyoto is that the president is not going to sign something that he's not sure that he's got the votes in the Senate on. And it doesn't necessarily mean the United States will not be an actor at some point in a rather strong way, but it means that you're not going to see a repeat of Kyoto where what's going on in the negotiating rooms in Copenhagen or any place in the future is the decisive factor. The decisive factor in all countries is what the political situation is back home. The UK and Germany are in a political situation where they can act. Someone has, one of the British diplomats told me that they thought one of the big differences was that Margaret Thatcher was a scientist. So within Europe, the conservative liberal debate about this issue has generally not occurred. There's been a few exceptions here and there, but in general, this is not a lightning rod issue. Whereas in the United States, it has been, and climate change is viewed as something that brings about big government. And if you go into the origins of this opposition, it was this that led them to conclude that the science wasn't correct. Because if the science was correct, it would mean big government. It wasn't because they went out and did some independent study to actually look at the science. So we're in a situation now where to get 66 votes, you're going to have to get some Republicans for a treaty. But you could do legislation by getting 60. In the U.S. system, you can filibuster, which means talk and talk and talk until you get 60 votes out of 100 to cut off the talk. So basically, you need 60 votes to pass something. The Democrats have 59. But they don't have all 59. Because in energy policy, there are a lot of practical economic considerations. So the United States has passed in its history 4 major pieces of energy legislation. All of them have been done in a fairly bipartisan way. The reason is you can't deliver everybody from either party because if somebody is from a coal-producing region, they're probably not going to vote for a strong climate change bill, even if they're a Democrat and their party is favoring that. So you're going to have to pick up votes across the aisle. So the vehicle for this happening in the United States would be what's called the Kerry-Lieberman Graham bill. There have been many Grahams in the U.S. Senate, so this is Lindsey Graham of South Carolina. And John Kerry is a Democrat. In fact, he was the Democratic presidential nominee in 2004. Lieberman was the vice presidential candidate for the Democrats in 2000, but is now an independent. And Lindsey Graham is an independent Republican. And so what would be needed is for Lindsey Graham to co-sponsor a bill if the United States is going to legislate in this area, and he would have to bring probably 5 or 6 Republicans with him, and I could name which ones I think might have a chance with. However, this issue has become so polarized that Lindsey Graham pulled out of the negotiations about 8 or 9 days ago, and there are 2 explanations of why he might have done this. One is he was upset that the Democrats were going to bring up the immigration bill before the climate change bill, and he thought that was a mistake, so he was going to pull out of the climate change bill. That would be the best case scenario. The best case, the other speculation is that he was not able to get any other Republican votes and wanted to extract himself from this awkward situation. So we've had the situation where the original Republican sponsor of the Senate bill some years back was John Warner, who was a very prominent Republican senator, somewhat better known around the world because at one time he was married to Elizabeth Taylor. But he was a very senior Republican, but he retired. Then the sponsorship, the Republican sponsorship of this bill was transferred to John McCain, who was the Republican nominee in 2008. But McCain now has a conservative challenge within the Republican Party from the right, so he's now not on the bill. So we're now into Republican sponsor number 3. For the last several months in all my talks, I've been saying that the future of climate change for the world, and I don't think this is too much hyperbole, rests on the shoulders of someone the world has never heard of, Lindsey Graham. And the reason I say that is I think what is needed is for the United States to step up and take leadership on this issue. It's a little country. It's just 4 to 5% of the world's population. But the U.S. has put up way over 30% of the accumulations. If you go, taking not emissions, but accumulations. The U.S. is a big part of this problem. It should be a big part of the solution. I do think a lot of countries do look at what the United States is doing. They don't want to be preached at by the United States, but they do notice what it's doing. And if the United States looks like they think this is a threat to its economy and a big problem, the body language is this isn't worth doing. And what needs to be done is for countries to step ahead and show that they can act and have success with it. Now, the fact that the United States at this point does not appear able to pass a cap and trade bill or some variation of the cap and trade bill does not mean all is lost. The United States right now is very rapidly updating its auto efficiency standards. It has strict mandates for the use of biofuels, including advanced biofuels. It is steadily ratcheting down the energy usage of appliances by federal standards. So it is, it's not like nothing is being done. Partly because of the economic collapse, but for other reasons, our emissions actually have gone down the last several years. So this is worth noting, and it could be this year that the United States might pass the Kerry, Lieberman, Lindsey Graham bill, or it might do nothing, or it might find something in between that it could do to use to say at least we did something. Now, how did we get to this point? One is I think cap and trade is, I would certainly accept cap and trade as a organizing format for this, but I do think it has a number of weaknesses, of which one is that it's not a very attractive term when you're in a developing nation. Just think about it for a while. Your economy is growing at 10% a year, and someone's talking about capping your emissions, which in effect kind of means capping your energy use. That doesn't have a good ring in a developing country. I think that President Obama's goal that he has announced, now we don't have policies in place to do this, but President Obama has stated the goal is to reduce carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050. Now that's not a small challenge, and it basically says that to make the numbers add up of where we need to be to keep the climate from changing for more than 2 degrees Celsius, that's the kind of requirement that would be needed from a nation of our profile with very high per capita energy use. There's a couple other problems with cap and trade. One is volatile pricing, and I probably should get into this because I think in the business world this needs to be understood better. One of the things I used to do at the Energy Department is track oil prices, and so I'm very aware of volatile oil prices. They can double or triple sometimes. It's a commodity. And so when you have a traded price of carbon, it's going to go way up where it's going to go way down. And it's going to